Hello lovelies, in this video the brilliant Dr. Upwards is going to be looking at adaptations for GCSE biology. So all of the examples that you are expected to know, but don't forget you also need to take these examples and be able to apply them to a new context in an exam.
So what do we mean by an adaptation? Well, for an organism to survive long enough to reproduce, it must be well adapted to cope with the selection pressures in its environment. Most adaptations are features of an organism that allow it to survive in an area that others cannot survive in. This helps to reduce interspecific competition, so competition between members of the same species, because what they're not having to do is compete against organisms of different species. So some common general animal adaptations include things like being able to attract mates more successfully, being able to catch prey more successfully, being able to hide or run from predators more successfully, and being able to maintain body temperature in extreme environments such as extreme heat or extreme cold. Common plant adaptations. A lot of these we've already discussed when we looked at water loss, but things like being able to compete better for light with other plants or water, so that means growing up tall or having extensive root systems, reducing water loss in hot, dry climates, so all of those adaptations we talked about, like sunken stomata, waterproof cuticle, etc. Being able to spread their seeds further, so having an adaptation to make sure their seeds get spread far and wide to get an increased chance of them germinating far away. Being able to attract pollinators, so that could be as simple as different coloured flowers, patterned flowers, size of flowers, whether the nectar is attractive or not to various pollinators. All of this is an example of extra adaptations that plants can have. There are 3 different types of adaptation. Structural, this is an internal or external physical feature, so part of an organism's actual body. So let's look at some animal examples. Body coverings such as hard shells or scales or fur, so that could be for protection like a shell, or fur to keep them warm. Camouflage, so the ability to hide from predators. Teeth or beaks or other physical features that allow them to catch or get different food sources. So there's 3 different types of bird beaks down there. They're all adapted for feeding on various different things. Mimicry, which is a good one, so copying another organism's look or sound in order to fool a predator or prey even. So it might be that they are specifically coloured to look like another organism that is poisonous, even if they aren't poisonous themselves, and that should deter predators from eating them, for example. Plant examples. So again, a lot of these are things we've looked at, so things like sunken stomata, waxy cuticles, swollen stems for storing water. All of these are obviously adaptations to water loss or living in kind of desert or dry environments. The shape of seeds to make sure they disperse properly, so things like those helicopter-shaped seeds, for example, that help them travel on the wind. And spines, so we know that that helps to obviously reduce the surface area of leaves for water loss, but also spines or hairs or sharp parts, thorns, can there to be a physical deterrent for herbivores. So a herbivore isn't going to eat something that's really sharp and spiky because it could damage their mouths. And also long or wide-ranging roots in order to make sure they can get extra water from the soil. Behavioural adaptations is the second type, and this is obviously the way an organism acts, and it can be inherited, so you can be born with this innate behaviour or you can learn it as you grow up. Animal examples. Something sort of behavioural that can protect some animals from predators is that they play dead, or perhaps they can roll up into a ball like hedgehogs. Courtship rituals, so these are kind of dances or songs or behaviours that specifically attract them to a member of the opposite sex in order to have successful mating, and this can be a lot of different ways. A lot of birds do this with different songs or dances or physical movements. Seasonal migration or hibernation, so when the weather changes, physically moving or knowing to travel to a different part of the world, or hibernating underground. Use of tools or language. These are 2 things that obviously use of tools can help you succeed in various environments to get various food sources, and that's something that you can learn. And responses to the environment, so either avoiding light or heat. If you're a woodlouse, for example, they can't be in hot, dry areas. They need to be in cool, dark, humid areas, so they will behave accordingly and move away from those areas that are not suitable for them. Plant examples of behaviour responses are things that we've probably heard of before, things like phototropism, so growing towards or away from light, geotropism, growing towards or away from the pull of gravity. There are quite a few of these and there's different examples. There's also mechanical or sometimes called nastic responses in plants, which are kind of physical responses. So could be climbing, so twisting and climbing around something that they can feel in order to grow upwards. Trapping insects like a Venus flytrap, that obviously results in detection of the environment and then a response. So there are some plants that can also deter herbivores. So they can detect being eaten or being touched, so physical movement. And then this mimosa here, it closes up its leaves. So it shut all its leaves down close to its stem and it physically moves them in order to do that. And that could sort of knock off insects, or it could sort of freak out herbivores that are trying to eat the plant. And then if you see here, all the leaves collapse down. It doesn't look very green and it doesn't look very appetizing to herbivores. So it can actually potentially stop them being eaten. Finally, functional adaptations. These are processes that go on inside an organism's body, but they're not thinking about them. So it's not behavior, they're not choosing to do a lot of this stuff. It's mostly to do with like the chemical reactions and the physiology of internal structures and systems that the organism has evolved. Animal examples, so things like producing poison or a venom is a physiological response because that requires special adaptations for cells and chemical reactions to produce it. Kidney adaptations, so hormonal adaptations, parts of the kidney that are able to retain water more than others. This allows them to survive in various places like deserts to retain more water. Reflex reactions to danger, so you've got the knee-jerk reaction here, but there's other reflex reactions, true reflexes, where you don't have to think about them, you're not involving the conscious brain, so they are there just to keep you safe, and they're physiological responses. Homeostasis as well is a physiological response, so it controls all of your internal conditions in response to your external conditions, so for example your temperature and blood glucose and things like that. Plant examples. Plants can produce toxins as well. So normally they're there to deter herbivores. So if a caterpillar comes and chews the leaf, it tastes bitter or horrible, and so it stops them eating it. And there's a picture of a tobacco leaf there. The tobacco leaf produces nicotine, which is there as a protective chemical to stop herbivory. We obviously have used it in terms of smoking and cigarettes, but it's there and we know it's a chemical that they produce. They can also produce chemicals from their roots to try and actually harm other plants to reduce competition. That's another thing they can do. Some plants can carry out something called CAM photosynthesis, which basically means they separate the reactions of photosynthesis into different parts of the plant, or they can separate them at different times. So they can carry out some of the reaction at night, for example, which would allow their stomata to stay closed during the day so that they reduce the amount of water loss, and then they can open their stomata at night to carry out gas exchange. Seed dormancy is another example. So physiologically, the seeds are able to sit in the soil dormant, so not germinating in dry and cold conditions. But when a temperature hits a certain point, or there's enough water or light or higher temperatures, then they will germinate. And that means that they know that when they germinate, they're going to be producing a plant in the correct conditions for it to be able to grow properly and survive. Adaptations are long-term responses to environmental change. They don't just happen straight away. Organisms don't choose for them to happen. Populations become adapted to their environment through natural selection over time. If the environmental changes are too rapid, so there's really big changes in the environment and they happen really quickly, faster than there can be multiple generations of a species, then the changes in the phenotype, those changes in allele frequencies that then lead to the new phenotypes or the adaptations, aren't going to happen fast enough. This can lead to entire species becoming extinct, and that means there's no more individuals left of that species alive. Let's look at an example of what we mean by that. So birds can migrate around seasonal temperatures, which can be affected by climate change. So you can see here we've got the Arctic tern migration. They will go to where it's warmest at each season. When it's winter in the northern hemisphere where we are, they will go south in order for it to be warmer. And then when it's winter in that part of the world, they'll come back to where it's summer in the northern hemisphere. And this is so that they will breed where there's going to be a lot of insects hatching. So there's going to be lots of food for them to be able to feed their chicks and for them to survive. If, due to climate change and other factors, the spring temperatures start to increase and arrive earlier in the year, then more plants then start flowering earlier in the year, which means there's more food for insects then. So they start to breed earlier and produce their young earlier. And therefore, if the birds migrate at the same time as they normally do in that year, when they arrive to the northern hemisphere, spring may already have been over because it started earlier because the temperatures have been changing. And therefore, if they breed, they might breed too late. And so when their chicks have hatched and are ready to be fed, there's no more larval insects and bugs to be able to feed them because they've already sort of grown up and become adults and started mating themselves. So this can lead to kind of a disconnect between the environment and the changes in the environment, leading to impacts on food chains, which ultimately could lead to there being not enough food. So that generation of chicks many of them may not survive. So then we have a reduced population. And if that happens enough, or it happens, really rapidly, faster than the birds can figure out to migrate earlier in the year, then it means that we could potentially see the extinction of that species of bird. Extremophiles. These are a type of organism that's been highly adapted. So they're very specialised and they've adapted to live in what we'd call extremely harsh environments where very few other organisms could survive. Examples of extreme environments are things like very high pressure, very high salt content, very high temperature. We've mentioned some of these before, and we've mentioned extremophiles when we talked about archaea, so that group of bacteria that includes the extremophiles. High pressure would obviously normally kill organisms because it would crush them. If you can cope with high temperatures, it means that your enzymes would not denature at the normal temperatures we'd expect. And high salt content is an interesting one because if you think about it, that would mean that outside of your cells would be a very highly concentrated solution. So normally all of your cells would lose water by osmosis, but they are able to live in the high salt content environment and not lose water from their cells due to osmosis. And that allows them to survive there. Like we said, a lot of extremophiles are bacteria. An example are ones that live around deep sea hydrothermal vents. This is where hot water and gases from the Earth's core are coming up and out through a vent in the ocean, like a rock, like a volcano underneath the ocean, but not lava coming out. It's just hot water and gases. This is very high temperature, high pressure because it's deep down in the ocean. There's no light, so they can't do any photosynthesis, and there's toxic gases coming out of these deep sea vents. You may have seen those little tube worms on the diagram there, about 6,000 meters. They also live around these structures as well. And some of that red color that you can see in them is actually produced by pigments, and the bacteria may have similar pigments to this in order to be able to survive.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.